Hello, book lovers. It's Robert Boyd coming at you with another book report, and this time I'm going to do another shelf. And as I mentioned in my last blog post, I'm going to try and improve the quality of this a little bit, based on what I perceive as the excellent quality of the competition. Not that I'm really in competition with them, because the other book bloggers and vloggers that I follow, they're so good that I feel totally inadequate to compare myself to them. But I do want to try and get a little bit better. So the first book we're going to mention, we're on the third shelf here, shelf 3. And the first book on shelf 3 is not the first book. There's actually several. So Mark Halperin, there's a couple of Mark Halperin books, and I do like Mark Halperin, a very oddball, conservative magic realist. But the first book I'm going to mention is Dune. Dune was a book I read in high school, and there's a bunch of Dune books. Frank Herbert wrote Dune, and he wrote Dune, and then the second one is called Dune Messiah, and then the third one is called Children of Dune. And those are the only ones I've read. And then after that was God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, Chapter House Dune, and I just haven't read those. They sound interesting, but my experience is that each subsequent book was less good than the first. So the first is really the only one I care about. I think the story is pretty familiar. It's a science fiction story set in... we don't really know exactly how far in the future it is, but there's faster than light travel. There's no computers for some reason. Actually, it implies that there was a jihad against computers, against thinking machines, at some point in humanity's past. The faster than light travel is accomplished by navigators of these gigantic spaceships who take this this drug called spice, which gives them precognitive abilities, which apparently is necessary to travel faster than light. So that's sort of the level of technology. I mean, in other words, it's far above our level of technology, but imagine everything is mechanical, nothing is computerized, but still there's some things that we just don't have. There's humanity is ruled by an imperial power, and it has a bunch of noble houses. So not unlike feudal Europe. And one thing you don't really get a feeling for in Dune is what the average person is, what their life is like, and whether or not their ambitions are constrained by the fact that they live in a quasi-feudal society that's otherwise highly futuristic. But I don't know. He doesn't go into that. One of the houses is House Atreides, and they rule a very lush planet that's very good for growing things. It's very wet. It's got oceans and so on. But for complicated political reasons, they've been told to leave that planet and move to another planet called Arrakis, also known as Dune, hence the title. That is almost a complete desert, which is really unusual. If you have a planet that supports life, it's probably not going to ever be a complete desert. But in this case, it's a complete desert because the native fauna, which are called sandworms, and they're and the sandworms have a life cycle, and before they become sandworms, there are these little animals called sand trouts, and somehow what the sandworms and the sand trouts do is to suck every bit of moisture out of the environment. So there's hardly any free water at all on Dune, and what we find out is what water there is has been carefully cached away by the people who live out in the wild desert called Fremen. So the hero, and this is what makes this book perfect for like a high school level reader, is that the hero boy who becomes a leader of Dune after a coup of sorts against his family by a rival house, the Harkonnens, and he and his mother flee into the desert, where they are taken up by the Fremen. And when I read it, I recognized that the Fremen had a somewhat Islamic tinge to them. They were sort of Bedouins in a way. But what I didn't think about, and what I definitely think about now, is that here's this white guy, Paul Atreides, who goes into the desert and becomes like the leader of the Fremen by having a variety of mystical experiences and so on, due to the fact that he's been carefully bred for thousands of years by a political organization of women called the Bene Gesserit, and they've essentially bred. They wanted to breed like the ultimate human, but Paul's mother, Jessica, decided on her own not to have a daughter, which they had instructed her to do, which they have the mental power to like change the sex of one's own offspring, but instead had a son because her husband, Duke Leto, very much wanted a son. So she kind of screws up the Bene Gesserit's plans, and in doing so, creates a superhuman in the form of Paul, the 15-year-old boy from Caladan, which is where the Atreides were ruling. And he goes to Dune. He's almost instantly addicted to spice, because one of the reasons Dune is important is because it is the only planet where spice forms, which the navigators of the spaceships require in order to travel faster than light. And therefore, it's in its own way a very rich planet, even though it's an extremely hostile planet. It's not really a planet for people to live on. But the Fremen do, and they've adjusted, and what they've built is gigantic secret caches of water, again with another white guy, the planetary ecologist, Keynes, I think, is his name, who's told them what they need to do in order to reclaim the planet and make it habitable for ordinary people. Unlike the Fremen, who are not ordinary, they are really tough. They're unbelievably tough. And that's one of the weird conceits of the book, is that they're so tough that they're tougher than even the Emperor's toughest soldiers, who are bred on a horrible prison planet. So Frank Herbert's idea is that if your environment is really bad, you're going to get tough. As opposed to what I think is reality, is that if your environment's really bad, it makes you weaker and easier to conquer. But, so, going back to my concern as an adult, is that Paul becomes the white savior of the Fremen. It's not really said that the Fremen are Arabs, but they are, compared to the sophisticated royal houses and noble houses like the Atreides and Harkonnens, they are kind of backwards people who live out in the desert, and they're considered somewhat mythical by the people who live in the one city on Dune. And so he becomes this leader of a massive jihad against the Empire. And it's exciting. It's a very exciting and well thought out book, but it is definitely kind of a white savior book. Anyway, that's the first book I wanted to mention. And there's been a couple movies made of it, or at least one movie and I think a TV series. And I don't really care. Although there's a trailer for a new Dune movie, and the trailer looks pretty entertaining, but I can't be a 15-year-old reading Dune again. I can only be this old guy who has mixed feelings about the white savior story. Okay, next we're gonna go to some Doris Lessing books, specifically this one, The Golden Notebook. I first read this while I was working in Nigeria, which is interesting because one of the main themes of the book is African colonialism. Doris Lessing, of course, is a British author, and she eventually won the Nobel Prize, but she hadn't won it when I read this book. It's not the first Doris Lessing book I've read. Before that, I read Reefing for a Descent into Hell, which covers one of her major themes, which is mental illness. In this case, it's sort of a first-person story of someone who's actually undergoing electroshock therapy. But in the case of a Golden Notebook, as you can see, it's a pretty big book, and it kind of tries to encompass all her interests at the time. I think she's writing this in the late 50s.
Anna Wolf is a writer, and she's got a writer's block. She was brought up in Africa, and while she was in Africa, she was radicalized. She became a communist, and definitely an anti-colonialist. That was one thing I noticed while I was reading it. I read it on a boat while working in Nigeria for the Nigerian Gulf, the Nigerian oil company, which was a joint venture with Gulf Oil. In order to try to break her writer's block, she starts writing in 3 notebooks: a black notebook, which mostly deals with her African childhood; the red notebook, which deals with communism and her disillusionment with communism; a yellow notebook, which is kind of an autofiction; and then the golden notebook is sort of everything she's writing kind of combined into one. And it sounds like somewhat mechanical when I describe it like that, but when you're reading it, it's switching back and forth between them, and so it has this density, as this web of things happening that she's writing about. And I was very moved by it, and I've read many Doris Lessing books since, and I love them. I didn't meet her, but I got her autograph once when she came to Houston, because the Houston Grand Opera put on a opera version of the making of a representative for Planet 8, which was composed by Philip Glass, based on her novel of that name. And she did a talk and a signing, and Philip Glass also did a signing. So I got both their autographs on 2 separate nights. Anyway, Doris Lessing. She won the Nobel Prize, and as far as I'm concerned, she deserved it. Okay. Now, a gigantic brick of a book, or actually a bunch of books. It's the collected works of Primo Levi. Primo Levi was an Italian chemist who, in the World War II, Primo Levi was a resistance fighter against fascism in Italy. And when I say he was a resistance fighter, that makes that sound like he's heroically blowing up train stations and stuff. But he really wasn't. He wasn't that successful as a resistance fighter, and he almost immediately got caught once he and his friends decided to join the resistance. Part of the reason he became a resistance fighter, aside from the fact that he hated fascism, he was Antifa before the name. But part of the reason he became a resistance fighter was because he was a skilled alpinist. He loved mountain climbing, so the guys in his resistance cell thought that would be a useful skill to have in northern Italy. But he got caught, and by the time he got caught, the Germans had invaded. The Germans invaded northern Italy when it was obvious that Mussolini was going to lose against the Allies. And when they invaded, they brought their extreme anti-Semitic policies with them. So they rounded up the Jews, including Primo Levi, and shipped them off to the death camps. and Primo Levi got sent to Auschwitz. And that's one of his books. If This Is a Man is basically a first-person account of being in Auschwitz. The weird thing is, when I read it, it was called Survival in Auschwitz. And that's another weird thing about his two best-known books, is that it got retitled in English. But If This Is a Man is the title that he preferred. And the second book, which is what happened to him immediately after Auschwitz, was called The Truce. But in English, or in the English edition I read, it's called The Reawakening. And really, the Reawakening, or The Truce, I should say, was the first Primo Levi book I read. And it was unbelievably uplifting and entertaining. And it gave you an idea of how weird it must have been to be displaced in Europe after World War II, because he's an Italian. He doesn't speak Yiddish like most of the other surviving prisoners in Auschwitz, so he doesn't really have that much in common with them, except that they're all Jews. And there's not like, he can't just hop a train and go back to Italy. So he ends up being evacuated by the Soviets, who had liberated camp, to the Soviet Union. He hangs out in the Soviet Union for a while in a displaced person camp, and ends up taking a long, complicated route back to Italy through a bunch of formerly Nazi countries like Austria, and I think he goes through Hungary. And anyway, The Truce is really good, but the brutal book, the book that made him famous, is If This Is a Man, where he's in Auschwitz and he remembers a lot, even though while he was there, like everyone else who was there, he was starving, sick, etc. The kind of things that are not conducive to like memorizing every little detail. The only reason he survived was because he was a trained chemist, and they needed someone to work in a laboratory that they had, where they were trying to make, I think they were trying to make synthetic rubber. I can't remember exactly what it was, but because he was a chemist and they needed people who were skilled at that, he became a helper in the laboratory. And but he says, it wasn't because he was like better than anyone else that he lived. He says it was sheer luck, because his coworker in the laboratory, who was essentially in the same situation he was, a trained chemist or laboratory worker of some kind, who lived in the same conditions, got the same number of calories a day that he did, died. And so he said, it's random who lived and died, except that it wasn't totally random, because, let's put it this way, 98% of the people who went to Auschwitz died. That's a astonishing fatality rate. And so If This Is a Man, he's always, in addition to witnessing what happened and describing it, he's always contemplating why this happened, what made it possible for the Nazis to think this was acceptable. But those two books, that would have been enough for anyone writing If This Is a Man and The Truce. Would have sealed his fame as a anti-Nazi Holocaust witness / survivor. But he kept on writing. He was he went back to Italy, and he became an industrial chemist, which was what he had been trained to do. And he kept on writing, and a lot of his writing is about chemistry, about being a chemist. And two of my favorite books of his are The Periodic Table, which is just a whole bunch of short stories, and each short story is named after an element in the periodic table. And then the monkeys, it's called The Monkey's Wrench in English, but it's just called The Wrench in Italian. I think The Monkey's Wrench just sounded cooler when they were translating it. And whoever translated his books just took extreme liberties with the titles, in my opinion. But it's about being a chemist or being a chemical engineer working on a plant in a foreign country, and he makes friends with another foreigner who's a rigger. So he makes friends with with someone who's more of a skilled laborer than a scientist like he was. And so it's a novel about their friendship and the stories they tell each other about their various jobs they've done. And what I like about it is that it's one of the few novels I can think of that's really about work, about guys, and, you know, let's face it, he was in a kind of masculine environment. So it's about people in a very work environment getting it done, getting the job done. And that was it was kind of inspirational. And so Primo Levi is a great author, or was a great author. He died when he fell in a staircase. And in a biography of him that I read, it said that it was possibly suicide. He had a really horrible family situation, but no one could say for sure whether it was suicide or not. But if it was, you know, he apparently had a full life up until that moment, and you know, you survived being sent to Auschwitz. Every day is a miracle. Okay, the last book I'm going to talk about is called North Toward Home by Willie Morris. And Willie Morris is most famous for being an editor. He was born in Mississippi, somehow got hooked up with the Texas Observer people. And the Texas Observer is a magazine in Texas, published in Austin, that's a very small circulation, liberal focused politics magazine that has managed to have a series of fantastic editors. And Willie Morris was one of them. Molly Ivins was one of them for a while. Anyways, it's basically a memoir. So he talks about being editor of the Texas Observer, and then he gets a job as editor of Harper's magazine up in New York City. So he moves to New York and makes friends with all the literati of New York. And the Harper's that he was in charge of, it's not like the Harper's of today. Then it was like this thick, slick magazine with fantastic covers. And it was considered a great magazine, and it was all because of Morris. But he ended up going back to Mississippi to write memoirs and some fiction that I've never read. But this book, you definitely get the feeling of what it was like to be a liberal in Austin in the early 60s when Lyndon Johnson was ascendant. And which, recalls another book that I talked about earlier, The Gay Place by Billy Lee Bramer, who also was, I think, wrote for The Observer. And then Harper's, you get the stories of the life of a big city literary magazine editor. But, he hired a bunch of great nonfiction writers to write a bunch of kick-ass nonfiction stories, which you don't see as much today. I mean, I guess The New Yorker is where you might see that stuff today, but back in the 60s, there were lots of places where that stuff appeared. Esquire, Harper's, Playboy even. And Willie Morris was one of the great editors, and I love him. So that is my book report for today. And what I haven't been doing, but I'm going to start doing is encourage you, if you like this, to hit that thumbs up button. And please feel free to subscribe, because I can use all the subscribers I got. Thank you very much.